The Hamilton County Property Tax Office maintains its historical assessment records in a windowless storage facility on Amnicola Highway outside downtown Chattanooga, where cardboard boxes contain decades of tax receipts and payment ledgers documenting property assessments and collections from every parcel in the county, going back to the 1890s, preserving the financial traces of who owned what land and who fulfilled their obligations to support municipal services through the property taxes that funded schools, roads, police protection, and all the other functions that local government provided. A woman named Claire Washington discovered impossible evidence in those boxes during the summer of 2021 while researching her family's history in Chattanooga, finding 23 consecutive years of property tax receipts from 1927 through 1949, showing her great-grandparents, Isaiah and Ruth Washington, paying annual assessments on 15 acres of land in what is now downtown Chattanooga along the riverfront. The receipts carefully preserved with the family's other important papers and confirming regular payments that the tax office had accepted and processed without apparent question or dispute about whether the Washingtons actually owned the property they were being taxed for owning. The receipts appeared entirely legitimate, bearing official county stamps and treasurer signatures, listing specific parcel numbers that corresponded to land that county maps from that period showed as existing along Market Street in what had been a mixed residential and commercial neighborhood before urban renewal demolished the entire area during the 1950s. Yet when Claire attempted to locate property deeds or title records documenting her family's ownership of the land they had paid taxes on for more than 2 decades, she discovered that Hamilton County maintained no documentation showing the Washingtons ever holding title to any property anywhere in the county, with official deed records indicating the 15 acres had remained in continuous white ownership from the 1880s through the present day, without any interruption that might have occurred. If an African-American family had actually owned the land during the middle decades of the 20th century, the contradiction between tax receipts proving her family had been assessed for property ownership and deed records showing they had never owned the property those taxes supposedly related to would be inexplicable under normal circumstances, but became a window into systematic dispossession when Claire discovered that dozens of other African-American families in Chattanooga had similar experiences of paying property taxes for years or decades on land that official records claimed they never owned, finding themselves in impossible positions where the county had been willing to collect their money for taxes assessed on property ownership that the same county refused to acknowledge in its deed records or protect through its legal systems when white interests wanted to acquire land that African Americans had been paying taxes on, as if they were legitimate owners, entitled to the protections that property ownership should have provided. The pattern suggested that Chattanooga's tax assessment and collection systems during the Jim Crow era had operated with deliberate disconnection from the property recording systems that documented legal ownership, allowing the county to extract revenue from African American families through property taxes, while simultaneously denying those same families the ownership rights that taxation should have confirmed and that should have been protected when urban renewal programs targeted their neighborhoods for demolition, that displaced residents who had been treated as property owners for tax purposes, but who discovered they had no legal standing to resist displacement or to demand compensation for property. The tax records showed them owning, but that deed records claimed belonged to someone else entirely. The mystery deepened when Claire examined exactly what the tax receipts documented, finding that they listed not only the parcel numbers and assessed values, but also specific legal descriptions of the property boundaries using meets and bounds descriptions that matched the land her great-grandparents had supposedly owned, indicating that county assessors had conducted the careful survey work necessary to properly identify the property and assign appropriate tax obligations based on its size and location and value, suggesting a level of administrative attention that contradicted any claim that the assessments might have been mistakes or that the Washingtons had been incorrectly taxed for property they didn't own, because the specificity of the legal descriptions and the consistency across 23 years of receipts demonstrated that the county knew exactly what property it was taxing and had deliberately assessed the Washingtons as owners responsible for paying taxes on that particular 15 acres along Market Street, regardless of what the deed records might have shown about who actually held legal title to the land. The receipts preserved in careful detail the county's acknowledgement that Isaiah and Ruth Washington were property owners, whose obligations included paying annual taxes at rates that reflected the land's significant value as downtown commercial property. Yet that same county maintained deed records treating the land as if it had always been owned by white families whose holdings urban renewal would eventually transfer to developers who built the hotels and office complexes that occupy the site. Today, without ever compensating the African American family that had paid property taxes on that land for more than 2 decades. Subscribe now because the evidence we're revealing exposes how Southern counties during the Jim Crow era deliberately maintained separate systems for taxing African American property owners and for protecting white property rights, extracting revenue from black families while simultaneously denying them the legal recognition and protections that property ownership should have guaranteed, and that might have prevented the systematic dispossession that destroyed black wealth across generations. Chattanooga spreads along both banks of the Tennessee River, where the waterway curves through gaps in the Appalachian ridges, creating a city whose development has always been constrained and shaped by dramatic topography that defines distinct neighborhoods, separated by elevation changes and natural barriers that reinforce the social segregation that white power structures imposed through law and violence during the period when Chattanooga was establishing the patterns of racial separation that would persist across subsequent generations. The downtown district occupies relatively flat land on the river's south bank, where 19th-century commercial buildings mark the city's origins as a transportation hub connecting the Deep South to markets in the Midwest and Northeast, where warehouses and manufacturing facilities once provided employment for workers whose labor built the prosperity that white families accumulated through ownership of businesses and property, while African American workers remained trapped in low-wage employment that prevented capital accumulation regardless of how hard they worked or how desperately they saved. The city maintained selective memory about its past, celebrating industrial growth and commercial success, while remaining profoundly uncomfortable with honest examination of the systematic theft that characterized how white institutions stripped African American families of property and wealth through legal mechanisms that appeared neutral, but that actually operated to concentrate ownership and opportunity in white hands, while permanently excluding black families from the economic advancement that property ownership might have enabled if legal systems had protected their rights with anything approaching the commitment with which those systems protected white property claims. The period from the 1920s through the 1950s represented a particularly devastating era for Chattanooga's African American property owners, with multiple waves of displacement and dispossession eliminating most of the black-owned land that families had managed to acquire during Reconstruction and the decades immediately following, when some limited opportunities for property ownership existed before Jim Crow fully consolidated and before white backlash against African American economic advancement resulted in systematic campaigns to eliminate black property holding through foreclosures, tax sales, fraudulent transfers, and outright violence that forced families to abandon land they legally owned, because maintaining ownership meant risking their lives when white supremacists decided that particular property should be transferred to white control, regardless of who held legal title or what rights property ownership should have conferred. The tax assessment and collection systems operated throughout this period as mechanisms for extracting wealth from African American property owners while providing none of the protections that property taxation theoretically purchased, with black families paying for municipal services they often didn't receive in their segregated neighborhoods, while simultaneously paying taxes that affirmed their property ownership, but that provided no legal protections when white interests decided to seize their land through urban renewal programs, highway construction, institutional expansion, or private development schemes that required clearing areas of African American residents whose presence conflicted with white visions for how particular neighborhoods should be used and who should benefit from their location and development potential. The Washington family's experience paying property taxes for more than 2 decades without their ownership being recognized in deed records exemplified how these parallel systems operated to exploit African American property owners while denying them the security and protections that ownership should have guaranteed, creating situations where families fulfilled all the obligations of property ownership, including paying substantial taxes that confirmed the county understood them to be owners of valuable land while simultaneously being denied access to the rights that should have accompanied ownership, including the ability to sell property, to use it as collateral for loans, to pass it to heirs through probate processes that protected white property transfers, but that somehow failed to protect black families whose property disappeared from official records, even when tax receipts proved they had paid assessments for decades on land the county had explicitly recognized them as owning for purposes of extracting revenue, but not for purposes of protecting their interests when white development pressures required removing African American owners from land that was needed for more profitable uses than black families could deploy, given their systematic exclusion from credit markets and commercial opportunities. Claire's investigation into how her great-grandparents had originally acquired the 15 acres they paid taxes on from 1927 through 1949 led her to examine family oral histories and documents that might explain how Isaiah and Ruth Washington had become property owners during a period when African Americans faced enormous barriers to acquiring land, and when white institutions worked systematically to prevent black families from achieving the economic independence that property ownership represented. Discovering that family stories described Isaiah purchasing the land in 1926, using savings accumulated through decades of working as a skilled carpenter, whose services white builders valued enough to employ him regularly, despite the racial discrimination that limited his compensation and prevented him from establishing his own construction business that might have competed with white contractors who wanted to maintain their dominance in the local building industry. The family narratives described Isaiah finding property along Market Street that a white seller was willing to convey to an African American buyer, completing a transaction that family members understood as legitimate sale, with proper deed being executed and recorded, with Isaiah beginning to pay property taxes immediately afterward in 1927, as evidence of his responsible ownership and his commitment to fulfilling all legal obligations that property holding entailed, including supporting municipal government through the assessments that landed property owners throughout Hamilton County, paid annually based on their holdings' value. The confidence with which the family had understood this transaction as establishing legitimate ownership, and the fact that Isaiah had immediately begun paying property taxes without any indication that the county questioned his ownership status, suggested that whatever documentation had been created to formalize the 1926 purchase had satisfied county authorities, at least for purposes of assessing and collecting taxes, even if that documentation somehow never made it into deed records or was subsequently removed from those records through processes that the family wouldn't have known about and couldn't have prevented, because they assumed that paying taxes proved ownership, and that the county's acceptance of those tax payments confirmed their legal status as property holders whose rights would be protected if they fulfilled their obligations, including the annual financial burden of property taxation that represented significant expense for a working-class African American family during the 1920s and 1930s, when economic pressures and racial discrimination made every dollar precious, and when maintaining property tax payments required sacrifices that the family made, because they believed ownership of downtown Chattanooga land represented their best opportunity for building wealth that might transform their circumstances and provide security for future generations. Claire's search for the original deed documenting her great-grandparents' 1926 purchase revealed that Hamilton County's deed records from that period showed no transaction transferring the Market Street property to Isaiah Washington or to any other African American buyer, with the land appearing in official records as remaining continuously in the ownership of a white family named Henderson, whose holdings included substantial acreage throughout downtown Chattanooga, and who appeared in property records as landlords and developers whose real estate operations had made them wealthy through ownership of land that increased dramatically in value as the city grew during the early 20th century. The Henderson family's documented continuous ownership of the property through the 1920s, 1930s, and 1940s directly contradicted the tax receipts showing the Washingtons paying assessments on that same land during exactly the same period, creating an impossible situation where two separate families appeared in different county records as owning the same property simultaneously, with neither record acknowledging the other's existence or explaining how the county could assess and collect taxes from the Washingtons for property that official deed records showed belonged to the Hendersons. The contradiction suggested several possible explanations, none of them reflecting well on Hamilton County's administration of property systems during the Jim Crow era, when white officials controlled all aspects of land documentation and taxation, and when their decisions about whose ownership to recognize in which contexts served to maintain racial hierarchies, rather than to protect property rights equally for all citizens regardless of their race. The most benign interpretation was that Isaiah Washington had indeed purchased the property in 1926, but that the deed had been improperly recorded or had been lost from county files through bureaucratic negligence that affected African American property documentation more frequently than white property records because the officials maintaining those systems cared less about preserving evidence of black ownership than about maintaining comprehensive records of white property holdings that represented the wealth and power that segregation was designed to protect and enhance. This explanation would mean the tax receipts represented the only surviving evidence of the Washingtons' legitimate ownership, with their regular tax payments serving as proof of property holding that the county had recognized for revenue purposes, even as the deed records that should have documented their legal title had disappeared through processes that might have been accidental, but that certainly weren't corrected despite the family paying taxes for more than 2 decades on property that deed records claimed they didn't own. A more troubling interpretation was that the county had deliberately maintained separate systems for taxing African American property holders and for documenting legal ownership, in ways that allowed assessors to collect revenue from black families based on recognizing them as owners, while simultaneously maintaining deed records that denied their ownership and that preserved white property claims that could be exercised whenever development pressures made eliminating black property holders advantageous to white economic interests that controlled both the tax assessment systems and the deed recording systems, and that could manipulate both sets of records to serve their purposes of extracting wealth from African American families, while preventing those families from exercising ownership rights that might have interfered with white plans for downtown development. Under this interpretation, the tax receipts proved not that the Washingtons owned the property, but rather that the county had recognized them as owners for purposes of taxation, while simultaneously denying their ownership in deed records that served different functions related to protecting and facilitating white property accumulation, rather than to accurately documenting who actually held legal title to particular parcels. The most cynical interpretation was that the county had knowingly taxed the Washingtons for property they didn't own, extracting revenue through fraudulent assessments that families paid because they believed the taxes confirmed their ownership status, and because refusing to pay would have resulted in the property being sold for tax delinquency, regardless of whether they actually owned it, creating a system where African American families could be taxed for property they didn't hold, while white families who did own that property avoided those tax obligations by ensuring the official deed records showed them as owners, while assessment records listed African American families as the taxpayers responsible for supporting municipal government through property taxes that the actual owners managed to avoid by exploiting the disconnection between taxation systems and deed recording, systems that county officials maintained deliberately to enable exactly this kind of exploitation. Claire's examination of the specific amounts that her great-grandparents had paid in property taxes across 23 years revealed that the assessments had increased steadily as downtown Chattanooga property values rose during the 1930s and 1940s, with the Washingtons' annual tax obligations growing from modest amounts in the late 1920s to substantial sums by the late 1940s, when the land's location and development potential made it extremely valuable, and when the tax burden became significant enough that maintaining payments required real sacrifice from a working-class family, whose income came from labor, rather than from capital investments that might have generated passive returns sufficient to cover increasing tax obligations, without requiring proportionally increasing work. The pattern of rising assessments suggested that county officials had recognized the property's increasing value and had adjusted the Washingtons' tax obligations accordingly, treating them as owners who should bear the financial burden of supporting municipal government based on their holdings' appreciating worth, yet providing them with none of the benefits that property ownership should have conferred, including the ability to leverage that appreciating value through selling parcels or through using the property as collateral for loans that might have enabled business investments or other wealth-building activities. The total amount the Washingtons had paid in property taxes across 23 years exceeded $10,000. a staggering sum for an African-American working-class family during the Depression and World War II era, when that money represented years of accumulated savings and when paying those taxes meant forgoing other uses for resources that could have funded education, health care, business ventures, or any number of investments that might have improved the family's circumstances in ways that owning highly taxed property apparently didn't enable, because the ownership existed only for tax purposes and not for any of the beneficial purposes that should have justified the substantial financial burden that property taxation imposed on families who faithfully met their obligations, believing that doing so confirmed and protected their status as legitimate property owners whose rights would be recognized when circumstances required official acknowledgement of who actually owned particular parcels. The question of what happened in 1949 when the tax receipts abruptly ended after 23 consecutive years of payments led Claire to examine whether her great-grandparents had sold the property or lost it through foreclosure or abandoned it for reasons that family oral histories might preserve, discovering instead that 1949 marked when Chattanooga announced plans for a comprehensive urban renewal program that would demolish several downtown neighborhoods, including the Market Street area where the Washington family's property was located, with the announcement initiating processes that would eventually displace hundreds of African-American families whose homes and businesses were destroyed to make way for commercial development that city leaders argued would modernize downtown and attract investment that would benefit the entire community, but that actually served primarily to transfer valuable land from African-American to white ownership, while providing displaced residents with minimal compensation that bore no relationship to the property's actual value or to the disruption and loss that displacement imposed on families and communities that were destroyed to serve white development interests. Claire's research revealed that the Washingtons had been among the families displaced by urban renewal, losing their Market Street property when the city acquired the entire area through eminent domain proceedings that theoretically required paying just compensation to property owners, but that in practice provided African-American families with far less compensation than white property owners received for comparable land, with assessments being manipulated to minimize what the city owed to black families, whose ownership was deemed less secure or less valuable than white holdings, even when both involved similar parcels in the same neighborhood that was being cleared for development. The eminent domain records from the urban renewal project showed the 15 acres that the Washingtons had paid taxes on for 23 years being acquired from the Henderson family, who received substantial compensation based on the property's value as prime downtown commercial land, with no mention of the Washington family or any acknowledgement that they might have ownership interests that needed to be addressed before the city could take valid title to property. That county tax records showed the Washingtons rather than the Hendersons owning throughout the period from 1927 through 1949. The pattern suggested that when urban renewal created conditions where the county needed to determine who actually owned the property, so that eminent domain proceedings could transfer valid title to the city for redevelopment, the official choice had been to recognize the Henderson family's ownership as documented in deed records, while ignoring the Washington family's ownership as documented in tax records, effectively treating 2 decades of tax payments as irrelevant to the question of who held legal title and who deserved compensation when the government seized the property for public purposes that actually served private development interests, requiring that African-American families be removed from land that was needed for more profitable uses than black property owners could deploy, given their systematic exclusion from capital markets and commercial opportunities. The decision to compensate the Hendersons rather than the Washingtons meant that a white family received payment for property that an African-American family had paid taxes on for more than 2 decades, transferring to white hands not just the property itself, but also compensation for its taking, while the black family that had borne the financial burden of property ownership through years of tax payments received nothing except displacement from the neighborhood where they had lived and worked, and built community connections that urban renewal destroyed along with the physical structures that were demolished to make way for development. Claire's investigation into whether her family had attempted to claim ownership or to demand compensation during the urban renewal proceedings revealed frustratingly sparse documentation, with no records indicating that Isaiah and Ruth Washington had participated in eminent domain hearings or had filed claims asserting their rights to compensation. based on their decades of property tax payments that proved the county had recognized them as owners for revenue purposes, regardless of what deed records might have shown, suggesting either that the family hadn't understood they might have legal claims that could be asserted during the urban renewal process, or alternatively that they had attempted to assert claims only to be told that tax receipts were insufficient to establish ownership, that deed records didn't confirm, and that the city would recognize only the documented ownership shown in official property records maintained by the County Register of Deeds, rather than the undocumented ownership implied by tax assessment records maintained by separate county offices that apparently operated with different standards for whose property holding they would acknowledge. The few family members who had any memories of the urban renewal period described Isaiah being devastated by the loss of the property he had believed he owned and had sacrificed to maintain through decades of tax payments that had consumed resources the family could have used for countless other purposes, if they had understood that the ownership those taxes supposedly confirmed would never be recognized when circumstances made acknowledging African American property rights inconvenient for white development interests that controlled urban renewal processes and that determined which families would receive compensation and which would be displaced without adequate payment for what they lost. The oral histories described Isaiah attempting to explain to city officials that he had paid property taxes on the land for more than 20 years, and that those tax payments proved his ownership, only to be told that tax records weren't equivalent to deed records, and that without documentary evidence of his ownership in the form of properly recorded deeds, the city had no obligation to compensate him for property that official records showed belonged to someone else regardless of how much he had paid in taxes assessed on the assumption that he owned the land. The emotional and economic devastation that this dispossession caused extended beyond the immediate loss of property to include the destruction of Isaiah's belief that he had successfully achieved property ownership that would provide security and opportunity for his family, discovering instead that 2 decades of sacrifice to pay property taxes had accomplished nothing beyond enriching the county that had collected his money while preserving white ownership claims that would be recognized when urban renewal made eliminating African American property holders advantageous to development schemes that required clear title, unencumbered by competing claims from black families whose tax payments suggested they might have ownership interests that would complicate land transfers. The betrayal of discovering that fulfilling property tax obligations hadn't actually established or protected ownership created lasting trauma for the family, with subsequent generations inheriting not just the economic loss of valuable property, but also the psychological damage of understanding that their ancestors' good faith efforts to be responsible property owners had been exploited by systems that extracted revenue while providing none of the protections and benefits that property ownership should have guaranteed. Claire's research into other African American families' experiences with Chattanooga's property tax and urban renewal systems revealed that the Washington story was far from unique, with dozens of families discovering that decades of property tax payments hadn't established ownership that would be recognized when urban renewal displaced them from land they had believed they owned based on the county's willingness to assess and collect taxes that property ownership supposedly justified. The pattern was consistent enough to suggest deliberate policy rather than unfortunate coincidence, indicating that county officials had systematically maintained disconnected systems for taxing African American property holders and for protecting white property rights, extracting revenue from black families through assessments that implied ownership recognition, while simultaneously maintaining deed records that preserved white claims that would be honored when development pressures required determining who actually owned particular parcels and who deserved compensation when government seized property through eminent domain proceedings. One particularly poignant case involved a family that had paid property taxes for 37 consecutive years on a commercial building in downtown Chattanooga, maintaining the structure in good condition and operating a successful business that served both black and white customers, only to discover during urban renewal that deed records showed they had never owned the building, and that the white family who supposedly held title would receive all compensation when the city demolished the property, despite the African American family having paid every property tax bill for nearly 4 decades and having invested substantial resources in maintaining and improving a building that official records claimed they didn't own. The family had attempted to sue for compensation based on their tax receipts proving ownership, but courts ruled that tax payments alone didn't establish property rights without corresponding deed documentation, and that the family's failure to verify their ownership through deed records before paying taxes for decades meant they had assumed risks that the legal system wouldn't remedy through allowing them to claim ownership or compensation based solely on tax payment history. The systematic nature of this pattern across multiple families and multiple decades suggested that Chattanooga's approach to managing African American property ownership through parallel taxation and deed systems represented deliberate policy designed to extract revenue while preventing Black families from accumulating the wealth and security that legitimate property ownership would have provided, ensuring that resources African Americans devoted to paying property taxes enriched the county without establishing ownership rights that might later have to be recognized and protected when urban renewal or other development pressures made transferring land from Black to white control advantageous to white economic interests. The policy served multiple purposes simultaneously, generating revenue from African American families who believed they owned property, maintaining white control over land that deed records showed white families owning regardless of who paid taxes on it, and preventing African American wealth accumulation that property ownership might have enabled if taxation and ownership had been honestly connected rather than deliberately separated to exploit Black families while protecting white property claims. Claire's attempt to determine what compensation mechanism might exist for families who had paid substantial property taxes for decades on land they were subsequently told they didn't own revealed that no legal remedies addressed this particular form of systematic dispossession, with statutes of limitation preventing challenges to urban renewal takings that had occurred more than 70 years earlier, and with courts consistently ruling that families who had paid taxes without verifying their ownership through examining deed records had assumed risks that the legal system wouldn't now remedy, through recognizing ownership claims based solely on tax payment history, regardless of how unfair the outcomes appeared when examined decades later, with full knowledge of how county systems had exploited African American families' good faith efforts to be responsible property owners. The legal framework that had enabled the original exploitation through maintaining separate systems for taxation and deed documentation now protected beneficiaries of that exploitation through doctrines that treated families' tax payments as voluntary rather than as based on reasonable assumptions that the county's acceptance of those payments confirmed ownership that would be protected when circumstances required official determination of who held legal rights to particular property. The broader economic analysis of what African American families in Chattanooga had lost through the systematic disconnection between tax payments and ownership recognition revealed staggering transfers of wealth from Black to white communities, with conservative estimates suggesting that African American families had paid more than $2 million in property taxes between 1920 and 1960 on land that urban renewal ultimately transferred to white ownership without providing Black families with compensation for property they had been taxed for owning, but that deed records claimed they never held title to legally. The $2 million in direct tax payments represented only part of the loss, with the greater harm being the denial of property appreciation and wealth accumulation that ownership would have provided if the systems had honestly recognized African American property holding rather than exploiting disconnections between taxation and deed documentation to extract revenue, while preserving white ownership claims that would be honored when development made transferring land from Black to white control advantageous to white economic interests. The contemporary value of property that African American families like the Washingtons had paid taxes on for decades exceeded hundreds of millions of dollars, with the downtown riverfront land that had been cleared through urban renewal now occupied by hotels, office towers, entertainment venues, and parking facilities that generate enormous revenue for their current owners who trace their title back through urban renewal takings that compensated white families whose deed records showed ownership while ignoring African American families whose tax records showed they had been recognized as owners for revenue purposes, but not for compensation purposes when the city seized property through eminent domain. The wealth gap between white families who received compensation for properties they hadn't paid taxes on and African American families who had paid taxes without receiving recognition or compensation when their supposed property was taken represents a direct line between Jim Crow-era exploitation and contemporary racial wealth disparities that persist as ongoing consequences of systematic theft, that legal systems enabled, rather than prevented. Claire's attempt to publicize her discoveries about the systematic disconnection between tax payment and ownership recognition faced significant resistance from institutions that preferred not to acknowledge how fundamentally corrupt Chattanooga's property systems had been during the Jim Crow era, when extracting revenue from African American families without protecting their ownership rights served white economic interests at every level of county and city government. Academic historians questioned whether tax receipts alone proved ownership, given the absence of corresponding deed documentation, suggesting that perhaps the Washingtons and other African American families had been paying taxes under mistaken beliefs about their ownership status rather than being deliberately exploited by county systems that extracted revenue while denying rights. This interpretation required ignoring the systematic nature of the pattern across dozens of families, and the obvious fact that county assessors conducting detailed property surveys to determine appropriate tax obligations would have known whether the families they were assessing actually owned the land being taxed or whether the assessments were fraudulent mechanisms for extracting revenue without any corresponding ownership recognition. The contemporary property owners whose holdings traced back through urban renewal takings showed no interest in acknowledging that their title chains might be compromised by the county's failure to recognize and compensate African American families who had paid property taxes for decades on land that eminent domain proceedings transferred to white ownership without adequate investigation of competing claims suggested by the existence of tax records showing black families being assessed as property owners. These current owners argued that they had purchased their properties through legitimate transactions and that whatever irregularities might have occurred during urban renewal weren't their responsibility and shouldn't cloud their titles or create obligations to descendants of families whose tax payments decades earlier supposedly proved ownership that official deed records didn't document. This position treated the systematic exploitation of African American families as unfortunate history that had no bearing on contemporary property rights, regardless of how directly current distributions of property wealth connected to the theft that urban renewal had enabled, through recognizing some families' ownership claims while denying others based on racial considerations disguised as neutral determinations about which documentation county authorities would accept as proof of legal title. The Hamilton County government showed minimal interest in investigating how its property tax and deed recording systems had operated during the Jim Crow era to exploit African American families, with officials suggesting that examining 70-year-old administrative practices served no useful purpose, and that contemporary tax and deed systems operated with greater integration and oversight that prevented the kinds of disconnections that had enabled earlier exploitation of black property holders who fulfilled tax obligations without receiving corresponding ownership recognition or protection. This response ignored both the ongoing harm that resulted from wealth transfers accomplished through the earlier exploitation and the question of what responsibility the county might bear for remedies that could address economic disadvantages that families continued experiencing as direct consequences of systematic theft that county systems had enabled and profited from through collecting property taxes from African American families whose ownership rights those same county systems refused to protect when urban renewal displaced them without adequate compensation for property they had been taxed for owning across multiple decades. The few legal scholars who examined Claire's documentation acknowledged that the tax receipts appeared to prove the county had recognized the Washingtons as property owners for revenue purposes, while simultaneously maintaining deed records denying that ownership, creating an internal contradiction in county records that suggested either extraordinary bureaucratic dysfunction or deliberate policy of exploiting African American families through taxation, while denying them ownership rights that would have to be recognized and protected if challenged by white interests wanting to acquire property that black families had been taxed for owning. The scholars agreed that contemporary legal remedies for this historical exploitation were essentially non-existent, given statutes of limitation and various doctrines protecting settled property transactions, regardless of how fraudulent or discriminatory the original processes had been, leaving families with documentary evidence of systematic theft, but without any realistic legal mechanisms for recovering what had been taken or for obtaining compensation that might begin to remedy the ongoing economic harm that resulted from their ancestors being denied property wealth. The tax payments suggested they had owned, but that deed records claimed belonged to white families who received compensation when urban renewal transferred property to city ownership for redevelopment. The impossibility of legal remedies reflected broader patterns, where American property law prioritized protecting current possession over correcting historical injustice, treating the passage of time as cleansing fraudulent or discriminatory transfers, and absolving beneficiaries of stolen property from any obligation to descendants of families from whom that property was taken through systematic exploitation that violated basic principles of fairness and equal treatment, but that operated within legal frameworks that courts consistently upheld as permissible exercises of government authority and private property rights. The protection that law provided to white property accumulation contrasted sharply with the complete absence of protection for African American families, whose ownership rights were denied when recognizing those rights would have interfered with white development interests, creating asymmetric systems where law served to facilitate racial wealth transfer rather than to protect property rights equally for all citizens regardless of their race or the color of the currency they used to pay property taxes that supposedly confirmed ownership. Claire's grandmother, now in her 80s, retained clear memories of her grandparents Isaiah and Ruth discussing the property they owned in downtown Chattanooga and the sacrifices they made to pay property taxes that represented substantial portions of their annual income during the Depression years, when money was scarce and when maintaining tax payments meant forgoing other uses for resources that could have purchased food, clothing, medical care, or countless other necessities that families struggled to afford during that economically devastating period. The memories included Isaiah explaining to family members that paying property taxes proved they owned the land, and that maintaining those payments protected their ownership from anyone who might challenge it, believing that fulfilling tax obligations demonstrated responsible citizenship and established their status as legitimate property owners, whose rights would be recognized and protected by the legal systems they supported through their tax payments. The betrayal of discovering that those beliefs were false, that the tax payments had accomplished nothing beyond enriching the county while leaving the family vulnerable to displacement without compensation, when urban renewal eliminated African American property, holding in neighborhoods designated for redevelopment, had devastated Isaiah and had created lasting distrust of government institutions that had exploited the family's good faith efforts to be responsible property owners. The grandmother described Isaiah's attempts to make officials understand that 23 years of property tax payments proved his ownership, regardless of what deed records might show, arguing that the county couldn't simultaneously collect taxes based on recognizing him as owner, while denying that ownership when it became time to determine who deserved compensation for property being taken through eminent domain. But his arguments fell on deaf ears as officials explained that tax assessment systems and deed recording systems operated independently, and that tax payments alone didn't establish ownership that deed records didn't confirm, leaving the family with boxes of receipts documenting decades of financial sacrifice that had accomplished nothing except demonstrating how thoroughly county systems had been designed to exploit African American families while protecting white property claims that would be honored when development interests required determining who actually owned land that multiple county records showed being owned by different families simultaneously depending on which system's documentation one examined and which purposes particular official determinations were serving. The emotional weight of these memories remained heavy across the generations, with Claire's family understanding the property tax receipts as evidence not just of theft, but of betrayal, proof that systems they had trusted and supported through their tax payments had exploited that trust to extract resources while providing none of the protections and benefits that taxation supposedly purchased for property owners who fulfilled their obligations to support municipal government. The receipts represented her great-grandparents' good faith efforts to be responsible citizens and legitimate property owners, efforts that were exploited by county systems operating in deliberately bad faith to extract revenue from African American families, while denying them the ownership rights that taxation implied, and that should have been protected when displacement threatened to eliminate black property holding in neighborhoods that urban renewal targeted for transformation that served white development interests at direct expense of African American families who had built homes and businesses and communities on land they believed they owned, because the county had taxed them as owners for decades, without ever suggesting that those tax payments didn't establish or confirm ownership that would be recognized when circumstances required official determination of who held legal rights to particular parcels. What remains in Claire Washington's possession are 23 property tax receipts documenting her great-grandparents' annual payments from 1927 through 1949 on 15 acres of downtown Chattanooga land that official deed records claim they never owned, preserved across 3 generations as evidence of systematic exploitation that destroyed her family's opportunity to build generational wealth through property ownership that county systems recognized for revenue purposes but denied for compensation and protection purposes when urban renewal eliminated African American property, holding in neighborhoods designated for redevelopment that would transfer valuable land from black to white ownership, while providing displaced families with minimal compensation that bore no relationship to property's actual value or to the decades of tax payments that had supposedly confirmed ownership. The receipts prove the county's acknowledgement that Isaiah and Ruth Washington were property owners, whose obligations included supporting municipal government through taxes assessed on their holdings' value. Yet that same county maintained deed records treating the land as continuously white-owned and provided compensation only to white families when eminent domain transferred property to city control for redevelopment that destroyed the African American neighborhood where the Washingtons had lived and worked and raised their family, believing they owned property that would provide security and opportunity. That systematic dispossession eliminated along with the physical structures that urban renewal demolished to make way for development. The tax receipts exist as evidence that property ownership for African American families during the Jim Crow era consisted of obligations without rights, of responsibilities without protections, of systems designed to extract resources while denying the security and wealth-building opportunities that ownership should have provided if legal frameworks had operated with even minimal commitment to equal treatment and to protecting property rights for all citizens regardless of their race. The 23 years of payments documented in those receipts represent thousands of dollars in direct transfers from a working-class African American family to a county government that used tax assessment systems to extract revenue based on recognizing property ownership, while simultaneously using deed recording systems to deny that ownership, when development interests required transferring land from black to white control without adequate compensation for families who had fulfilled tax obligations across decades, believing those payments confirmed ownership that would be protected when circumstances required official acknowledgement of who actually held legal rights to valuable downtown property. Claire's family will never recover the property that tax receipts prove the county recognized them owning for revenue purposes, will never receive compensation that might remedy the wealth loss that systematic dispossession caused across multiple generations, will never see county officials acknowledge that property tax and deed recording systems operated during Jim Crow deliberately to exploit African American families through extracting revenue while denying rights, and will never achieve the justice that their documentary evidence clearly establishes they deserve based on systematic theft that county systems enabled and profited from across decades of collecting property taxes from black families whose ownership those same systems refused to recognize or protect when urban renewal transferred valuable land from African American to white ownership through processes that provided compensation only to families whose deed records showed ownership, while ignoring families whose tax records proved they had been recognized as owners for the entirely different purpose of extracting revenue to support municipal operations. The tax receipts remain as testament to the systematic dishonesty of Jim Crow-era property systems that served to concentrate wealth in white hands while permanently excluding African American families from the property ownership that might have enabled economic advancement if systems had operated with even minimal integrity, rather than with deliberate disconnection between taxation mechanisms and ownership protections that allowed exploitation of black families' good faith efforts to be responsible property owners whose obligations were acknowledged but whose rights were denied, whenever recognizing those rights would have interfered with white development interests that controlled county systems and that ensured property would be transferred from African American to white ownership regardless of what tax records showed about who had actually been paying for the privilege of owning land that deed records claimed belonged to someone else entirely. Subscribe now so you won't miss our next investigation into American property systems where tax receipts prove ownership that deed records deny. documenting the systematic theft through which Jim Crow counties extracted wealth from African American families, while denying them the rights and protections that property ownership should have guaranteed, and that might have enabled wealth accumulation if legal systems had operated honestly, rather than as mechanisms for racial exploitation, disguised as neutral administration of property taxation and deed recording that actually served coordinated purposes of transferring resources from black to white communities across generations of systematic dispossession.